Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm June Foreman, host of Conversation Cafe. Thanks for joining me tonight. I want to talk about an historical win for the truckers, for the Freedom Convoy. You'll remember back in 2022 that the truckers rolled into Ottawa. They and their supporters stayed there for 3 weeks. At the end of those 3 weeks, Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet made the monumental decision to invoke the Emergencies Act to crush that protest. The protest was against vaccine mandates. Tonight, I don't want to so much talk about the actual outcome of Justice Mosley's decision, and his decision was that the act was in fact not constitutional. It was unjustified. But I want to talk about Justice Mosley's mindset in going into the proceedings around the invocation of the act, whether or not it was justified, whether or not it was constitutional. And I want to take a look at Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet in their deliberation. What made them come to the conclusion that they could invoke the act? I will briefly just give the top 10 reasons, according to Christine Van Gen from the Canadian Constitutional Foundation. Her foundation, along with the Canadian Civil Liberties Foundation Association, convinced Justice Mosley that in fact, going in, what he thought going into the proceedings was actually incorrect. And we're going to look at that in a minute. But I will just read briefly some of the statements that Ms. Van Gen has given to the audience, and I will post that link in the description below. But some of the reasons: Cabinet was not owed extraordinary deference when interpreting the act. There was no national emergency within the meaning of the act. The Emergency Act is a tool of last resort. No threats to the security of Canada within the meaning of the act. Economic harm is not a part of the threshold to invoke the act. And the list goes on. Thank you to the constitutional associations, the Civil Liberties Association of Canada and the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the incredible work that you put in to presenting the arguments as to why the invocation should not have happened. So let's go back to Justice Mosley. He made the statement that going into the proceedings, he thought he would render the decision that invoking the act was in fact justifiable and constitutional. But he came out the other end and said, in fact, he was wrong. Justin Trudeau and his Liberal cabinet went through a period of deliberation. They also determined that they could, in fact, just place this on the Canadian protesters, the Canadian public at large, in fact, but they were wrong. And so was Justice Mosley at the beginning of the proceedings. How did they get it so wrong? What was it about the climate at the time that they thought that Justin Trudeau and his cabinet thought that they could invoke this act on the Canadian population, particularly the protesters? I want to suggest that it was pressure from the media that put these thoughts, these preconceived ideas into the hearts of even lawyers and judges. And that's astounding. Media has incredible power and potential to nudge and to sway an entire population. Recently, I heard CBC Radio discussing Justice Mosley's actions. And they said, well, the Canadian population, they by and large agreed with it. So what is this? What does it matter that this particular judge rendered it this way? Especially in light of the fact that Justice Rouleau came out with the opposite judgment. He found after the inquiry that in fact, the act being invoked was justified. He also said that it would be just as easily reasonable to expect that a different judge could have found the opposite conclusion. So media has an incredible role in society. It needs to be neutral. It needs to be factual. It needs to cover both sides. So whether or not the protesters were in fact criminals, whether or not the fringe extreme element was taking over the entire agenda of the Freedom Convoy, those kinds of themes and understandings need to be explored at length. There are more than two, but two in particular incidents that I'd like to discuss about how the media shifted and nudged a particular narrative. This one particularly stays in my mind. It was the lawyer Keith Wilson who explained that the police every night would give an account of how many criminal acts happened in downtown Ottawa. And one night they reported 5 criminal acts. And the implication was that it was the Freedom Convoy who owned the fault of those acts. They didn't give context, they didn't give details, but the implication was the fault belonged to the Freedom Convoy. The lawyer, Keith Wilson, went on to say that 2 of those 5 acts were actually against the Freedom Convoy. They had their tires slashed. Another incident, a reporting by CBC on the Freedom Convoy, was the time that they asked a particular leader of the anti-hate organization, and his name is Bernie Farber. And Bernie Farber, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network leader, said this, that the protesters certainly could come and protest the actual health issues, but by doing so, you have walked in the shoes of bullies, racists, bigots, and Nazis. Bullies, racists, bigots, and Nazis. The people who are protesting government overreach, government intrusion into bodily autonomy, they are the ones that are following in the footsteps of bullies and racists and bigots. I don't think so. When you look back at what happened in Germany, because he said it, so I'll use that particular example. During Nazi Germany, it was in fact the people who resisted the government reaching in and controlling the mindset of the people, stirring up hate toward a particular group that we now look at and we abhor. It's not the protesters who are resisting the overuse and the abuse of power. Those are the people that we honor. Those are the people that we want to look deeply into to try to understand why it is that they are out there on the street in -30, why it is that they're willing to risk their livelihood. And I want to take a particular look at Dr. Byron Bridle. But first, it wasn't just the media. Also, Justin Trudeau called the protesters racist, misogynists, and science deniers. This is just so troubling to me, because as I have talked to many protesters around the Freedom Convoy and around the issue of vaccine mandates, it is because of the science that they protested, not because they were anti-science. And it's become abundantly clear to me, it does not take a conspiracy theory for things to go wrong. It does not take a conspiracy theorist for things to go wrong. It is one bad decision that leads to another bad decision that can lead to another bad decision, and then ego gets involved, and then entrenchment. And I think that's what happened to the Canadian population. I think it's what happened to even judges and lawyers, because they decided that it was okay to create a massive force against a population that was unarmed, that was peaceful, by and large peaceful. The honking of horns was a really bad strategy, and I completely sympathize with the people of Ottawa. So it was in fact the science that had people questioning and wondering. And I want to look at some of the scientists and some of the researchers. I earlier in 2023 interviewed Dr. Jayanta Bhattacharya around the public health response in the US. and in Canada. And he said, we had information very early on that the virus was most affecting negatively those who were elderly and those who had comorbidities. And that in fact, we should have targeted our response to protect those who are most vulnerable, the elderly and those with comorbidities. I'm not trying to deny that younger people did suffer death and great injury from the COVID virus. But by and large, it was a certain population. And if we had have focused the protection, according to Dr. Bhattacharya, we would have been much better off. That's just one doctor. He and Sunetra Gupta and Martin Kulldorff, Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, these are not lightweights. They were smeared. Dr. Francis Collins, emailed Dr. Anthony Fauci and said, we have to have a swift and public takedown of these fringe epidemiologists. Fringe epidemiologists. Dr. Bhattacharya has been around since before H1N1, and he helped with the public response during that crisis. And here are powerful men trying to censor scientists, colleagues who have had respect for each other in the past. And I do want to look at Dr. Byram Bridle of Guelph University. He was commissioned to do research on the vaccine and the adverse events that could have followed somebody being vaccinated. And he was asked the question by media, is there a connection between myocarditis and the vaccine? And he said, yes, there is a connection. And for that statement, for actually doing the research that he was commissioned to do, he lost his job at Guelph University. In fact, a fake Facebook page was made in his name. He himself said he's an introvert, a quiet individual, never was on social media, but somebody made a fake Facebook page and his colleagues commented on it in nasty ways. That's just one example of how Canadians were treated. There are many doctors, even now, still reporting on the adverse events around those who are vaccinated against COVID-19. I'm not saying that the vaccine didn't save lives. I understand more and more that it did, but it has also caused a lot of harm to a lot of people. Not just harm to their bodies, but this entire issue has separated us from one another, has divided colleagues, divided families, kept us away from the activities that would have helped our mental health, like getting out to the gym or going out to a restaurant. I sat in a group of 6-7 nurses who had given their lives to help people. And all through COVID, they were willing to take extra shifts. All through the COVID before the vaccine came onto the scene. They were going to the hospital, keeping people safe, willing to take extra shifts. And then when they refused the vaccine on legitimate grounds, they were kicked out of their profession. It was listening to their stories. Actually, that was a catalyst for Conversation Cafe. I just cannot believe some of the things that have happened around this issue. But going back to the scientists, Dr. John Campbell, Dr. Asim Malhotra, Dr. Pierre Corey, Paul Merrick, Robert Clancy, many of you might know these names, but these are professionals that are saying, wait a minute, we need to slow down because there are connections, not necessarily connections in the sense of causal, but there are connections, there are correlations between an increase in deaths in 2022 and 2023 that just are unprecedented. We need to investigate. Why is that not happening, for example? So my whole point here is these protesters went to Ottawa because of the science, because they were concerned that the government was overreaching. And here they have been labeled as misogynists, racists, bigots, Nazis. And mainstream media has contributed to that. So much so that a judge who knows the law, who who understands the requirements that it takes for a Canadian government to invoke this incredible canon. It's a big canon against peaceful protesters. This is extremely troubling for me as a Canadian citizen. It should be troubling to all Canadian citizens. And I don't hear an apology. What I hear is a defiance of the law and a willingness to spend taxpayers' money to take this back into court and try to get an outcome that would save face for Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland. I hope this doesn't happen. I hope that you will send a letter to your government, tell them to accept the ruling of Justice Mosley, tell them that his decision was based on solid logic. It was based on lawful arguments. It was based on the law. But we need accountability. Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government needs to be accountable. I'm not sure how, but there has to be a reckoning. Thanks for listening. Please share your comments below. I will try to get to all of them. I really appreciate you watching. Please, if you like this video, share it, subscribe, and like it. Thanks for listening.